Well, this morning you are here to hear Judith Sumner. And Judith Sumner is a botanist who specializes in flowering plants and ethnobotany. She studied at the Royal Botanic Gardens and did extensive field work in the Pacific region. Sumner has taught at the college level and at botanical gardens, including the Arnold Arboretum at Harvard University. She has been a guest on Martha Stewart Living, the PBS program Cultivating Life, and the Annenberg Learner channel. Her most recent book is Plants in the Civil War, A Botanical History. And that's what she'll be sharing with us this morning. So welcome, Judith.
And thank you to all of you for coming out very early on a weekend morning. So I'll tell you a little bit about the history of this history book. 2019, I published a book about the botanical history of World War II. And as a botanist who writes in the area of historic economic botany, I always like to try to find book topics that no one else has covered before. Because a lot of botany books have been written over and over and over. And so I'm trying to find topics that no one else has ventured into. Richard Evans Schultes, who's widely regarded as the father of ethnobotany, was at Harvard for many years. And he always said that we should let the botanists write some of the history because so many conflicts involve botanical issues. Whether it's food, agriculture, shortages, medicine, something, it all boils down to plants. And so often classically trained historians sort of back away at that point because they don't know the botany. So after I wrote the book on the botany of World War II, we launched into the pandemic. And I needed a pandemic project. So this is my pandemic project. And coincidentally, it worked out really well because so much of what I wanted to read had just recently been digitized. And so I'm so thankful to all of these wonderful librarians at places like Princeton and Penn and Cornell and Michigan who supervise the digitizing of vast numbers of 19th century agricultural and other publications, ephemeral publications that otherwise would have been difficult for me to see during the pandemic. So we're going to talk about the ways in which plants were involved in the American Civil War. That's the topic for today. And you know, I don't know if we want to try to dim the lights a little bit. Can we dim them a little just so the slides have a little bit more contrast, do you think? Do we have a way to do that? Great. Perfect. So this shows you some of what the book covers. And the book has gotten good reviews, and some of the reviewers have commented that the book is very much slanted toward the Confederate States. And that is so true, because it was the Confederate States that really were impacted by the war and where we saw the shortages and the accommodations had to be made to daily life. And so much of the book really does cover what life was like in the South. But the whole idea of slavery, if we go back before the Civil War, was not endemic to the South. And in fact, if we go back to colonial America, slavery was in the original colonies. It was abolished by about 1780, but much of the money that was coming into the original American colonies resulted from triangle trade, sugar, rum, and slaves coming from Africa. And that was a source of income for many of the original colonies. The big difference in enslavement between the North and the South was that in the North, enslaved people became skilled at some craft. They were trained as printers, as builders, as carpenters, as coopers, making barrels, as printers. I think I said printers. In the South, they were used for brute force labor in agriculture. The South became highly dependent upon a cluster of cash crops, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. And in order to produce those cash crops, they needed enslaved labor. And that was why the South dug in and did not want to give up slavery as easily as it was abolished in the northern colonies. So today, I'm going to talk about really 4 clusters topics. Crops and slavery, because they were intertwined. What life was like on plantations. Medicinal botany, which at that time was largely dependent upon plant medicines. And then landscapes and war, how the war affected landscapes. And we'll include in that a little bit on military engineering as part of the landscape discussion. So these were the cash crops, indigo, tobacco, rice, sugarcane, and cotton. And what did they have in common? Well, they were all non-native to the US. They were all tropical or semi-tropical. They were all luxury crops. There wasn't a single one of those that you had to have. People look at cotton. Well, we didn't have to have cotton. No, we could have grown linen. We could have grown flax. There were other fibers available. So there's not a single one of them that was absolutely essential. They could all be grown on a vast scale in hundreds, thousands of acres in the southern climate. They all were highly productive in the southern climate. And the limiting factors for all of them basically were in common: labor, and this is where the enslavement issue came in, land. They took up a lot of land, they took up a lot of space, and tied to the whole land issue was the soil nutrient issue. Going into this type of agriculture, growing these plants intensively, they wore out the soil, and the soil would become nutrient poor, depauperate of nutrients, primarily nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and stuff just wouldn't grow anymore. And so what do? You clear more land. How do you do it? You have enslaved labor. And so it became somewhat of a vicious cycle. So we'll take a quick look at these. Indigo was one of the first crops that was grown on plantations. It was the source of a lasting blue dye, sort of the blue dye that you see in blue denim, blue jeans. And this plant was popular at first as a crop plant on plantations, and then dwindled by the early 19th century in popularity. Tobacco. Tobacco was actually thought to be medicinal at the time, and it was thought to prevent the plague. And so much of the tobacco that was grown was actually grown, presumably, as a medicine, as a plague preventative. And this became a large, very labor-intensive crop on plantations. Rice. Rice required water, at least the varieties of rice that were grown on plantations. And so this was in coastal areas that could be flooded, and the rice paddies were difficult in as much as the Anopheles mosquitoes that spread malaria would breed in these rice paddies. And so the owner class tended to clear out of Dodge during the time of year that the flooding occurred of the rice paddies. They were not going to stick around with their wives and daughters and children and themselves and get malaria. And they left the slaves there to actually grow the rice. And we'll talk more about that later, how the slaves coped with the malaria issue. Sugarcane was actually originally from Papua New Guinea. It was Asian Indians who figured out the whole idea of crushing the stems, getting out the liquid, and crystallizing the sugar. And sugarcane was another huge crop, very demanding of the soil, and required a lot of work because you had to harvest the canes and then crush them to get out the liquid. It was a big production. And then, of course, the single most important of all of these crops was cotton. Eventually became known as king cotton. There were 2 varieties grown. The second one, Gossypium barbadense, is the softer, the coastal cotton. And this also was extremely labor intensive. There was something had to be done in the cotton fields virtually year-round. Cotton fibers come in two types, long and short. They actually are hairs that grow on the seeds. So the hairs cling to the seeds. They cling tenaciously to the seed. The short ones were the linters, and the longer ones were the lints. And depending upon what type of cotton you were growing, you would have different proportions of these long and short hairs. And you can see what they look like in the scanning electron microscope picture in the upper right. One of the big limiting factors with cotton production was getting these hairs separated from the seeds. Another big limiting factor was what cotton plants did to the soil. So the roots of cotton go down 4 to 6 feet into the soil, and they wear out the soil in a few years. In 1804, the explorer Alexander von Humboldt discovered the bird islands off the coast of South America that literally had mounds of bird dung, known as guano, that could be mined and used as a fertilizer. So early in the 19th century, he sent samples back to Europe. This bird dung was tested. It's high in nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, the exact mineral salts that were needed in the soil in the south. And so they started mining bird guano and sending it into the southern states. It was $76 a ton. A typical acre needed 400 to 600 pounds of this stuff. It was expensive at the time. Unscrupulous dealers in guano would stretch it. They would add other stuff to it, sawdust and stuff, to sort of stretch it out a little bit. All the agricultural magazines, newspapers, leaflets, pamphlets were filled with ads for guano and touting different types of bird dung and spreading it out on your soil. This was only used by the most wealthy farmers, really the plantation class. Ordinary southern dirt farmers who were farming for their families and for subsistence, small farmers, used anything else organic that they could get their hands on. Rotted leaves, manure from animals, manure from humans, known as night soil, emptying out the chamber pots, anything, tea, whatever they had. But this was what the big guys used. And when you hear about King Cotton was fueled by bird dung. Puts a little different spin on it, doesn't it? So here we are. The demand for cotton was very high. It was in the industrial Northeast where you had the big mills that were making the thread and weaving the cloth. There were no mills at this point in the South. The South was not industrialized. A lot of the demand for cotton came from clothing. If you look at that picture from Godey's over there in the lower right, those dresses required about 15 yards of cloth. And going into the mid-1800s, wealthy women wanted silk. But then there was an interesting little switch that occurred. This is Marie Antoinette here, dressed in a little cotton frock, looking like a little French farm girl. And this fashion took off. And it took off in England, and then it sort of filtered over to the US. And so a lot of very wealthy American women had closets full of these little cotton frocks. And this just increased the demand for cotton all the more. And so this stuff was grown in the South, shipped north, and then processed in the North to make cloth. And it was sort of a symbiotic relationship. That last limiting factor being the removal of the fibers from the seeds. And that's where the cotton gin comes in. So the cotton gin was actually invented by a Yankee, right? And he was actually from Westboro, Massachusetts, which is 2 towns over from where I live, in Worcester, Massachusetts. And he was working as a tutor in Georgia, and he saw the struggles that plantation owners were having with processing the cotton. The plantation owners would have enslaved people sitting at tables painstakingly picking the seeds out of the bowls of cotton, and it was very time consuming. And so Eli Whitney got the idea, and it was sort of based on something they were doing in India with using combs to comb the seeds out of cotton. And he made sort of a prototype of the cotton gin and then larger ones, and it basically worked on the idea of a comb which would then pull away the fibers and separate out those seeds. He did not get rich from the cotton gin because U.S. patent and trade law was very primitive at the time, and other people interested in making money from the ginning of cotton. And the word gin comes from engine, that this was considered an engine. So the ginning of cotton was something on people's minds. They would look at the Eli Whitney design and then tweak it in some little way, make some little minute change, and this is my cotton gin and my cotton gin. So there were literally hundreds of cotton gin patents that were filed with the patent office in Washington, D.C., and you can actually see these if you want, if you're interested. They were all published in early editions of Scientific American, which was the magazine, sort of the catalog, if you will, of the Patent and Trade Office. And so Whitney did not make a lot of money with this, but he was the one that got the ball rolling with an efficient method of separating out the seeds. This left a huge sort of parallel industry of what do we do with all the seeds? And the seeds were used to feed cattle, and sometimes the seeds were used whole, but more often the seeds were crushed to get out the cottonseed oil. That was sold for illumination, soap, machinery, and leather. Oddly, I don't think it was eaten. Now cooking is done with cottonseed oil. I think at that point they didn't use it for food. And then typically all those mashed seed coats were squished into cottonseed cake, and those were fed to cattle. So this was sort of a parallel industry to use the waste left over from king cotton fibers. So in the North, there were abolitionists who opposed all of this, because even though there were not enslaved people in the North anymore, the abolitionists thought, well, we want to avoid using the products of enslavement. And so in the Northeast, a lot of interest in making sugar from maple trees. A lot of artwork came out of this. Top right, that is one of the paintings by Eastman Johnson, basically promoting in sort of an abolitionist way the gathering of sap and the boiling down of sap in the late winter to get maple sugar. That's a Currier and Ives image in the lower right, same sort of thing. Sugar maples are native to New England, so it was something that was available to use. And then the growing of flax to take the place of cotton. And a lot of real patriots and abolitionists in the Northeast wore flax clothing rather than cotton. I'll tell you something, though. It's not as warm. Cotton has little side fibers when you make the fabric that trap air and trap warmth. And to go through a New England winter in an unheated house without central heat, wearing only flax, must have been pretty miserable. You know who writes about that actually is Louisa May Alcott, Little Women. Her father was an avid abolitionist and had all the girls wearing linen clothing in the Northeast. So let us segue on to plantation life. This shows you a little bit about how the slaves actually were living. The first slave dwellings were built by the enslaved people themselves. You would arrive as a group of enslaved people on a plantation. And so in the top left, that is the first type of house they built. And it basically is an African-style house with a thatched roof. And so early 19th century, that's what originally was on some of these plantations. The plantation class of owners did not like those. They didn't want sort of an African image on their land. And so those were quickly replaced with log cabins. The log cabins were, in many plantations, replaced with clapboard type cabins that mirrored the building materials used in the big plantation houses. The best wood for building came from the bald cypress because the wood is very much resistant to fungi. And so if you wanted slave dwellings that would last a while, you would make them out of bald cypress wood. Initially, many of the houses had dirt floors. They had just little interior fire pits. Over time, planter class realized that slaves would not reproduce if they weren't happy in their houses. And so they improved the housing because slave babies were another commodity that could be sold. So some of them eventually had bedsteads, chairs, maybe even a table, and a fireplace. And over here in this little inset is another Currier and Ives image. So, we think of Currier and Ives engravings as being so evocative of America and so darn tasteful, right? Just so beautiful, and many people had them framed in their homes. And I tell you what, I got a couple in my kitchen at home, But Currier and Ives also produced a very tasteless set of engravings known as the Darktown Comics, and that's one of them. And it shows some hapless enslaved people trying to put out a fire in a slave dwelling. And that's what the Darktown Comics showed, was hapless and disorganized, supposedly comical behavior among black people living as enslaved people on plantations. So let's see here. Enslaved people on many plantations built secret places for themselves to meet using botanical materials. These were known alternately as brush arbors or hush harbors. Some of them were actually made in cane brakes. So along rivers in the Old South, there was a plant called cane. It's sort of a native bamboo, very, very tall grass. You can see some of it here. You could hollow out a little place in one of these cane brakes and have a secret meeting and sing and talk, and nobody could hear you because the vegetation would deaden the sound. So some of these arbors or harbors were in the cane brakes. Others were patterned after the temporary buildings that were constructed by itinerant ministers and their followers for revival meetings. These would be deep in the woods, away from the homes of the planters and the owners of the slaves. And they were places where tales were told, information was exchanged, songs were sung, and there was often a mashup of African and Christian religion that was shared and preached in these areas.